When we talk about airline color schemes, it's interesting to note that American Airlines used the same basic color scheme from the DC-3 in the 1930s through the 1950s, the epitome of the piston era, and into the jet age of the 1960s. We're going to look at these aircraft in this episode of Celebrating Aviation with Mike Mashat. Our story begins in 1955. This is a Revell DC-7 model, and you'll notice that in the cockpit, the pilot is waving at you. But this began my fascination with American Airlines. I built this model as a kid and always been interested in American's color scheme from this point on. It's interesting to note that even that DC-7 had the orange lightning bolt stripe, and that carried through to the Astrojet like this Boeing 727. Let's take a look at the American fleet and see how this color scheme evolved. Started on the DC-3. This is actually the DST, which stands for Douglas Sleeper Transport. And this was an airplane that was envisioned by President C.R. Smith. It allowed passengers to sleep on their transcontinental trip, which took just under 2 days back in the 1930s. The DST was identified by the windows above the regular windows, the rectangular window you can see here. This is a United airplane. And we see the flight attendant, or stewardess as they were called in those days, serving breakfast. Love this photo. This is the DC-4, America's first four-engine airplane. And this airplane's making a high-speed pass at Santa Monica. The photographer's up on the bluff at the east end of the runway, and these pilots are having a heck of a good time. But pretty dramatic shot showing you Americans' color scheme philosophy with the lightning bolt stripe, the orange diamond on the nose, and then the color carried out to the engine nacelles, as well as the trailing edge on the outer wing and horizontal stabilizer and rudder. Next came the DC-6, which was America's first pressurized airplane. And the DC-6 could fly cross-country with only one stop. It was kind of the thoroughbred of the airliners, a very rugged, reliable airplane. And American flew them literally into the late 1960s. The Convair liner, the Convair 240, went into service with American in the late 40s, early 50s. And this was the equivalent of what is today called a regional jet. This served the smaller cities and had the self-contained stairs. And it was just a really great little airplane for short stage lengths, New York to Washington, New York to Boston, LA to San Francisco, things like that. And so this was a very valuable airplane to Americans' fleet. It had a unique engine. It was powered by Pratt, like the DC-6. It was powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800. And this had what they call the flower petal nacelle, which opened up, as you see here, to allow access for the maintenance. Really a novel approach, great design by Convair. Queen of the fleet then became the DC-7. This was an evolution of the DC-6, had longer range. This was the first airplane to be able to fly nonstop from LA to New York, and in 1953. And it was a great airplane. It was the backbone of the fleet in the 1950s. This is the DC-7B, which is identified by the spinners on the props as opposed to the silver hubs that were were straight DC-7. Nice dramatic shot of it coming in for landing. The first class lounge was in the back of the airplane, oddly enough, and that was because that was the farthest away from the engines and the noise and vibration. So the club lounge in the tail of the airplane, and this is what it looked like looking out the window of the club lounge. This is a photo that my dad took on a flight on an Eastern DC-7. But American used DC-7s and the 6s, as I say, all throughout the 1950s. That was the backbone of the fleet. Here's, you can see all of these airplanes at LAX, boarding passengers. And then came the jet age. This is the first iteration of the Boeing 707, which used the same fuselage as the KC-135 Stratotanker. And that meant a 5 abreast cabin layout. And it was Americans, President C.R. Smith, who convinced Boeing to match the Douglas DC-8, which had 6 across, and that was a game changer. They changed the width of the fuselage, and the 707 then could carry up to 120 passengers, and that made it a much more competitive airplane, and the rest is history. So let's take a look at this color scheme as we examine all the airplanes in the fleet. Here we see the DC-3, and there it is on the 707, that same basic orange lightning bolt. I can't stress enough how exciting this time period was. In early 1959, Pan Am had been flying the 707, but overseas. You didn't see them within the United States at that time. But American changed that. In January, they started transcontinental service. But all the media, the magazines were covering it, and you'd see it in newsreels, if you remember those in the movies. It was just an amazing time to think that you could buy a ticket and fly at 600 miles an hour anywhere in the world, cutting travel time in half. It was just an amazing time period. So here's American's first 707, just on the ramp at Renton. This is a publicity photo shoot. You see the flight attendants there on the boarding ramp. And I should point out that this is a time before terminal buildings had been designed for the jets. I'd say at least for the first year, maybe even 2 years that the jets were in service, you went upstairs to get in the airplane. There were no jetways or jet bridges. And so you walked out on a ramp in the rain and snow or heat, whatever, but you boarded the airplane just the way you would any other airliner until the terminals were modernized for these airplanes. Beautiful study of the 707 on the compass rose at Renton, Boeing's plant up near Seattle. Look at the lines of this airplane, just so clean and elegant. It's referred to as the short tail version of the airplane, and you'll see why in a moment. And I should point out, if you look at the window line up on the forward fuselage, you notice that the 7th window back from the door is blocked out. That's the window just below the M in American. And what that is a bulkhead. Forward of that wall is a first-class club lounge for first-class passengers. First class went all the way back to the leading edge of the wing, and then the rest was coach. Much larger first-class section than what you find on jets today. And as I mentioned, you go up the boarding stairs. This is a shot at LAX, but I wanted to mention here that you see the ground power unit plugged into the airplane. This airplane was totally dependent on ground equipment to run the systems and air conditioning and everything else. They did not have APUs at that time, auxiliary power units, and so it was a whole different way of operating the airplanes. Starting engines and everything was all done from ground power. And speaking of the engines, look at those pods. Those are Pratt & Whitney JT3s, which are the commercial version of the J57, which flew in airplanes like the F-100. And it was about 12,000 pounds of thrust. You see the pipes on the back, which gave the airplane the name Straight Pipe from the airliner guys. And those are sound suppressors. These were loud engines. I remember as a kid, these things would fly over my apartment in Long Island, New York, on their approach to Idlewild Airport, and in the wintertime especially, where the cold air conducted the noise even more, I had to have my fingers in my ears. It was painfully loud. But in those days, you said, well, it was a jet, that's what they sound like. And nobody, we weren't as sensitive to noise as we are today. But look at the fleet mix. You got the 707. Again, this is a shot at LAX, and there's an American DC-7 and a DC-6 in the background. And so the jets were still pretty new at that time. And this is a very historic photo. This is the takeoff of Flight 2, the first transcontinental scheduled jet service with a Boeing 707, American Airlines flying from LAX to New York. And you see the airplane climbing out all at 6 degrees deck angle, trailing the trademark black smoke, which was created from water injection. They injected distilled water into the engines to boost the thrust on takeoff. But this is a crowd up on Imperial Boulevard watching the jet inaugurate transcontinental service for the first time on January 25th, 1959. Entering service that same month was the Lockheed Electra. This is America's first 4-engine turboprop, I should say only 4-engine turboprop transport, and used by the Navy as the P-3 Orion. Great machine, 400-mile-an-hour cruise, just a really elegant airplane. And again, brought turbine-powered service into America's smaller airports. Um, this is a staged shot at Burbank with models posing as passengers deplaning. But you get an idea of the size of the airplane. And again, a self-contained boarding stair for convenience. Beautiful looking down from a cherry picker, I guess, at the uh, Electra on the ramp at Burbank. You see the Eastern airplane in the background, pre-delivery. Beautiful proportions, relatively stubby wings, but just those big props were, when they bit into the air on takeoff, boy, it was like a slingshot. Beautiful dramatic view, big cockpit windows. The Electra was a passenger favorite. Everybody loved the spacious cabins. The airplane held from between 66 and 98 passengers, depending on the configuration. And it was a real crowd pleaser, a beautiful airplane. Then we have the 720. Now, this is an interesting machine because the 720 was the first member of what became Boeing's family of jet airliners, going up through the 737 and 747 in 1970. But the 720 was 9 feet shorter than the 707 and lighter weight. And this allowed it to operate from shorter runways, and it brought jet convenience to medium-sized cities around the United States and around the world. But it had a few distinctive features. And yet on the tail, it said 707 jet flagship. Why would they do that? Now you know why airliner historians have gray hair. Even though it's a 720, they just referred to it as a 707. The difference, there were several differences. One was the engine pylon. You notice on the 707, there are turbo compressors in the forward part of the pylons on all 4 engines. And on the 720, the outboard engines, because it's a smaller cabin, they don't need 4, so they're deleted, and you have that odd stubby pylon on the outboard engines. But more important than that is that the airplane only had 1 overwing exit because of the shorter cabin. On the 707, it's 2 overwing exits. They're kind of hard to see, and this points out why in 1965 the FAA mandated that emergency exits and doors would have 3-inch stripes identifying them for ground crews in emergencies so that they could find these exits more easily. But as I mentioned, the 707 had the 2 overwing, 720 only has 1. Then we have the 990. What an amazing airplane. This was called the Maserati of Jets. It was the world's fastest jet transport up until the Concorde. It cruised at 615 miles per hour. It was powered by General Electric J79 fan jets. And this posed a problem because the GE engines didn't integrate as well into the rest of the airline fleets that had Pratt engines, Pratt & Whitney engines. But the 990 was quite a machine. The problems were that it had a high fuel burn, and it only carried 100 passengers. It was a smaller airplane, 3 and 2 seating and coach. But the secret to the speed of the 990 was what they call the speed pods or shock bodies. These were Whitcomb designed aerodynamic fairings that mitigated the shock wave at high Mach numbers on the trailing edge of the wing. The next step was the Astrojet, and that was a trade name for the fan jet powered airplanes. These were the JT3D -4 fan jet engines, which were more powerful. You can see the larger fan section at the forward part of the engine nacelle, and the shroud of cooler air coming out of the fan surrounded the exhaust and actually quieted the exhaust and alleviated the need for these noise suppressors that we saw on the original 707. Ultimately, all the straight turbojet 707s for American were retrofitted with the fan engines and all became Astrojets. The BAC 111 replaced the Convaires and the DC-6s on the shorter routes. They were called Astrojet 400s, powered by Rolls-Royce Spey engines. They were quite a nice machine. Carried about 85 to 90 passengers, depending on the airline configuration. I flew a BAC 111 on Braniff, and it was a great little airplane. I can't say enough. A comfortable ride, really effective, efficient airplane. And then we have the 727. In 1963, American inaugurated 727 service, a tri-jet. And this was an interesting airplane because it was a completely self-contained package. In other words, it could go into a small rural airport, and it had an APU in the trailing edge of the right wing. So it had its own ground power, and it had a rear boarding stair and a front boarding stair as well. So it didn't need ramps. And it was just a very efficient airplane. It could have quick turnarounds on the ground and brought jet travel and jet convenience to America's smaller cities and, again, all around the world. It was a revolutionary airplane in its day. It's ironic, too, that the last Astrojet was a three-engine airplane, and Americans' first modern airplane was a three-engine airplane, the Ford Trimotor that you see here. But I'm really big on aviation progress, and I want to just talk about the improvements in aviation through this American fleet. Here you have the Curtiss Condor biplane, of all things. But here's the cabin of the Condor. And take a look at that cockpit. You have a chain drive wheel that looks like something off an ocean liner. And the basic 6 instruments are shared by the pilot and co-pilot. That's kind of interesting configuration. But compare this to the American Overseas Airways 749 Constellation. Quite a leap in technology. And if those control wheels look familiar, it's the same wheel out of a P-38 Lightning. Now, as advanced as this was over the Condor or the DC-3, take a look at the first 707. They always commented in the ads that there were 100 less buttons and switches and dials in a jet cockpit than in the piston-powered airplanes. And it had new devices like leading and trailing edge flaps, dive brakes, speed brakes, spoilers, etc., thrust reversers, all new technology for the jets. And yet on the panel, there was no flight director. It was just the basic aerodynamic instruments. That changed in the later versions of the 707. I should point out, too, this had what they called eyebrow windows. If you look at those smaller windows above the windshield, that allowed visibility in the turns and just gave better lighting and better visibility in the cockpit. And here we have today the Boeing 787 Dreamliner flown by American. Same information, same basic fundamentals, but a different way of presenting that information to the pilots, all digital technology. And I should point out that the first 707 had a cockpit crew of pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer on international flights for those international airlines. It carried 5 in the cockpit. It had a navigator and a radio operator. So all those different disciplines were done by different individuals. In the 787, it's 2 pilots and a whole bunch of computers, and it's a much simpler way of flying, much more reliable, and ultimately much safer. So when they were talking about the future, this is what they were thinking of: a Boeing 2707 supersonic transport. This would have been the ultimate Astrojet, Mach 2.7 with 300 passengers. The SST never happened in the United States for environmental and political reasons. They were envisioned in the late 1960s and canceled under the Nixon administration in 1971. But this is what it would have looked like as an American Airlines Astrojet. And in closing, I just want to mention that as pioneering as the 707 was in its day, in early 1959, they were very scarce. You would see a Pan Am or an American airplane. In March, TWA started service. And in December, United introduced the DC-8. But seeing a jet at an airport in 1959 was pretty darn special. And so this is a nice mix of TWA Connies, an American DC-6, and the 707. So there you have it, a look at American's fleet and the continuity of the color scheme from the DC-3 into the jet age. Thank you for celebrating aviation with Mike Mashat. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'd like to say thanks to the late Craig Cadera and John Proctor, whose collections were used in the making of this video. And if you enjoyed it, please subscribe. You can hit that button at lower right. We'd love to have you on board. And until next time, take care.